This presentation is going to be on the intersection between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. There are many definitions for migrant smuggling. Ms. Sealk's definition in her publication on migrant smuggling in Latin America is one that I found to be concise and that I favored the most. She states that migrant smuggling involves the provision of a service, generally procurement of transport, to people who knowingly consent to that service in order to gain a legal entry into a foreign country. Migrant smuggling is a global problem. It occurs in nearly every country. As of 2015, it has been reported to be a $26 billion industry for the smugglers, who are often organized crime groups and gangs. Migrant smuggling undermines the integrity of countries and communities because migrants cross borders without documentation or regulation. The most tragic effect is that it costs thousands or more of lives every year. It is difficult to know the true number because many of these individuals are undocumented and purposely evade record. Migrant smuggling has been around since there have been defined countries. However, with the increased focus on immigration reform, recent political conflicts, and its link to human trafficking, with which it is often confused, it has stepped into the spotlight. This is an example of migrant smuggling that is close to home and has been occurring for a long period of time, and so its link with human trafficking is well documented. And that is of Latin Americans who leave their home countries due to poverty, lack of opportunity, and violence, among other reasons. Mexican citizens often cross this border with the United States in order to stay or continue on to Canada or even Europe. Additionally, Mexico serves as a bridge country for migration flow of migrants from Central America into the United States, with the main countries in Central America being Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The drug cartels have a powerful presence in Mexico, and corruption is as prevalent as law enforcement is absent. Thus, migrant smuggling and human trafficking have become a big business for them. Before I continue on, I want to underline the point that human trafficking and migrant smuggling are not actually synonymous. While the definitions sound similar and the two are often confused, there are key differences. The first difference is one of consent. Migrants who are smuggled, even though often done in dangerous situations, have consented to being smuggled. Human trafficking victims have never consented, or may have initially consented. However, it is meaningless given that they are at some point forced against their will through the use of threats or other means. The next difference is exploitation. That is, in migrant smuggling, the smuggling ends as soon as the migrants arrive at their intended destination. For human trafficking victims, there is ongoing exploitation of the victims to continually provide an economic profit for the traffickers. The third difference is that migrant smuggling is always transnational, or always crosses borders. Human trafficking may occur transnationally. However, it is not necessary for the situation to be considered a trafficking case. The final difference is the source of profits. In cases of migrant smuggling, the profits come from payments from the migrant for transportation to another country. For human trafficking cases, profits are derived from the exploitation of the individual. Now that I have told you why they are not the same, why is it important as social workers that we understand both migrant smuggling and human trafficking? Well, this is because displaced persons, migrants, aliens, undocumented residents, whichever term you prefer, are more likely and often do fall into situations of human trafficking, and this is the intersection between the two. Some trafficked persons may start their trip by agreeing to be smuggled into a country, but they might find themselves deceived by their smugglers or traffickers and ultimately forced into an exploitive situation later in the process. Traffickers may try to disguise themselves and present an opportunity that sounds more like migrant smuggling to the potential victims. However, and they could even be asked to pay a fee in common with other people who are smuggled. However, the true intention of the smuggler or trafficker from the beginning is exploiting the individual for economic profit. So, what are some of the specific reasons why migrants are at risk to falling prey to human trafficking? Migrants are more at risk to become trafficking victims because they lack legal status and protection in the country that they have moved to. They have limited communication skills in this new country. They are often socially isolated. Because of these previous two reasons, they often have limited employment opportunities, and as a result of all of the previous reasons, they are often living in poverty. Further, there is a very fine line between a smuggler and a trafficker. It is a small step for a smuggler to decide to control and force the migrants who are depending on them into situations of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Smugglers hold significant control over migrants, and whether they are a stranger or a relative, migrants are often dependent on them for financial or other support. In Mexico, thousands of Central Americans fall prey to drug cartels while crossing over the southern border of Mexico and following migration flow patterns. These migrants often cross over with the intent of continuing on to the United States. However, some simply seek a better life in Mexico. This past year, although the United States saw a reduction in migrants from Central America, Mexico saw twice as many migrants from Central America. This is in part due to the increase of migrants traveling and also a tightening border between Mexico and the United States, which traps many South and Central Americans in Mexico. The primary countries of origin, as I said earlier, from Central America are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Once they are in Mexico, these migrants fall prey to sexual exploitation or forced labor in the agricultural, textile, or domestic industry. Mexico has a particularly large sex tourism industry, especially near the United States border, and, as you guessed it, many of the tourists are coming from the north. Cartels involved in the trafficking also force victims to benefit the cartels by engaging in illicit activities such as servicing as lookouts or potential hitmen. The government in Mexico is corrupt, particularly at the local level, and it is often under control of the cartels either by force or bribes. They are at best complacent, and they are at worst in aid or actually assist in trafficking schemes. Because the Mexican government does not fully comply with anti-trafficking laws, they are considered to be a Tier 2 country by the U.S. Department of State. The picture that I've shown to you on this slide is of Tapachula, Mexico, which is a city which shares its southern border with Guatemala, where Central American youth are often enticed by smugglers by the promise of jobs and a better life in Mexico, but they end up forced to work in brothels. If Latin Americans, either from Mexico or some of the more southern countries, end up making it into the United States, the risk to become trafficking victims remains high. In part, this is due to the failure of the federal government to adequately address the illegal immigrant dilemma that has perpetuated an environment of exploitation on undocumented men, women, and children. Latinos are drawn to the United States by promises of a better life, more opportunities, and better jobs, which are often used as promises by smugglers who ultimately end up trafficking them for the purpose of exploiting them for economic benefit. For example, there are immigrant smugglers, which are known as coyotes, who help individuals cross over into the United States. These migrants are desperate to arrive, and they turn over thousands of dollars for transportation. However, the coyotes often enslave those in their charge for an indefinite period of time, and women and children are particularly vulnerable to falling prey to traffickers. Undocumented children are probably the most vulnerable of the group, and over 75% of undocumented children in recent years that have crossed over the border have crossed with the help of a smuggler. As you can see, there are many examples of the intersection between migrant smuggling and human trafficking. On this slide, these are some examples of recent news articles that have been covering this issue. What all of these circumstances and articles have in common is that all individuals were first smuggled into the United States and ultimately became a trafficking victim. The pictures at the bottom are from a documentary called The Cantinera, which looks into human trafficking of Latino women who are smuggled into the country with the promise of a job, but they end up working as companions who often are forced to prostitute themselves and drink a lot of alcohol to men in bars or cantinas, which are near the Mexico-US border. After seeing these slides, I think you can agree that migrant smuggling, immigration law, immigration rights, and human trafficking are all connected, and they are all issues that perpetuate the bigger problem of social injustice to these immigrants. These individuals, no matter what their place of birth or their culture, deserve the same opportunity to live their lives without fear of slavery, entrapment, violence, and sexual abuse. So, as social work professionals, what are our roles? One, it is our role to be aware of the problem. What are the current immigration issues in our country? What are significant migrant communities in my area? If you suspect that somebody has been smuggled into the United States, you can ask, do you have a passport? Do you have a visa? If not, who has it? Does your family know how to contact you? In an unimposing and non-judgmental way, so they are not fearful. You could also try to identify by looking for red flags. So what are these individuals' living conditions? Are they recent arrivals to the United States? Do they have a job? What kind of job? You can be a connection to them, be a source of support, connect them to programs that are put in place to help them. And finally, you can educate them, which is just a better word for talking to these migrants and tell them about the dangers of falling into human trafficking schemes, and also give them a plan moving forward. So if they were recently smuggled and they find themselves in a situation where their smuggler is maybe changing and forcing them into situations, what can they do? I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and that it has been informative on the differences and similarities between migrant smuggling and human trafficking in the United States.